It's strange how oblivious you can be to something until it's practically staring you in the face. I always believed Grace and I were rock solid, or at the very least, something we could repair if it ever started to crumble. We'd experienced our share of good times and bad, like any couple. But lately, things had felt off, like a hairline fracture you don't see until the whole thing shatters. Looking back, it's astonishing how much I overlooked or willfully disregarded, dismissing it as just a phase she was going through or stress from work. Turns out it was considerably more than that. A whole lot more. It began subtly, or perhaps it didn't, and I was simply too preoccupied to notice. One evening, after she arrived home late yet again, I realized she barely made eye contact, let alone engaged in casual conversation. And when she did speak, her responses were short and curt, as though she had somewhere else to be, even when we were in the same room. It felt like she was miles away, constantly glued to her phone or seemingly lost in her own thoughts. Whenever I attempted to connect with her, it was like pulling teeth. It was peculiar, especially for us. We used to talk about everything, from weekend plans to what we'd name our future children. Suddenly, all those conversations vanished. She'd brush me off, claiming exhaustion or an overwhelming workload. The first time I genuinely thought something was amiss was one morning at breakfast. We were both sitting there, coffees in hand, the early sunlight streaming in, and she was completely absorbed in her phone. I'd never witnessed her so distracted. Then, out of the blue, I saw her smile at something on the screen. I can't quite articulate it, but there was something about that smile, something intensely private, like whatever held her attention on that phone was infinitely more important than anything we'd ever shared. I asked her, half jokingly, "Who's got you grinning like that?" She froze momentarily, then dismissed it with a quick, "Oh, it's nothing," and changed the subject so abruptly I barely had time to blink. I distinctly remember a pang in my stomach, a primal instinct warning me, but I suppressed it. Maybe it's just work, I reasoned. Maybe I'm overthinking. But the nagging feeling persisted. After that, things just became increasingly strange. She started dressing differently, purchasing new clothes and accessories that were well outside our usual budget. When I questioned her about it, she'd offer vague explanations about needing to fit in at work or wanting to look the part. It didn't ring true. This was Grace, the woman who used to mock designer labels. Now she was suddenly decked out like a fashion model. She'd never been particularly concerned with appearances, but now she seemed like a different person altogether. Then came the parties. I'd always been the one to persuade her to attend social events, but now she was the one constantly going out, attending these work functions that, for some unexplained reason, I wasn't invited to. She'd assure me they were strictly professional and wouldn't even let me drive her. One evening, however, I decided to surprise her. I figured I'd give her a little shock by showing up unannounced. I pictured her face lighting up when she saw me, imagined her embracing me and introducing me to her colleagues. It didn't quite pan out that way. I walked in, and there she was, cozying up to her boss, Max. I'd heard of him, she'd mentioned him in passing a few times, but seeing them together like that, the way they were laughing and leaning in close felt like a punch to the gut. She was beaming, looking at him like he was the most captivating man in the world. When she spotted me, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Her face paled, and she stammered something about needing to leave. Before I could even utter a word, she made an excuse and practically dragged me out of there. I tried to convince myself it was innocent, but my gut told me otherwise. I didn't know who to confide in. Talking to family was too humiliating, so I reached out to Lawrence, an old friend of ours. He'd known us both for years. When I finally recounted everything, Grace's coldness, the phone obsession, the new clothes, the work party with Max, he simply listened. He didn't dismiss my anxieties or tell me I was being paranoid. Instead, he suggested talking to her, perhaps even considering couples therapy. I knew he was right. We had to confront this if there was any hope left. When I brought it up to Grace, however, she shut me down so quickly it nearly took my breath away. "Therapy?" she scoffed. "What do we need therapy for?" She dismissed my concerns, claiming I was overreacting and blowing things out of proportion. The way she looked at me, like I was some kind of inconvenience, stung more than I care to admit. That's when I knew something was truly, irrevocably broken. It wasn't just a rough patch, it was something else entirely. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I'd been blind to before, or perhaps I'd simply chosen to ignore. She'd come home late, then even later, until there were nights she didn't come home at all. She'd claim to be on a business trip, but I'd catch her in little lies, saying she was at a conference but having no proof, dodging my calls, barely responding to texts. Physical affection? That was completely out the window. She'd brush me off with a quick, "I'm tired," or a dismissive, "Maybe tomorrow," like I was some annoyance rather than her husband. She was barely present even when she was physically standing next to me. I couldn't just sit idly by and let this consume me. I needed answers. So I did something I never imagined I'd do. I started snooping. I checked her social media, went through her call history even, took a look at her credit card statements. Nothing concrete jumped out at first, but there were small discrepancies that didn't quite add up. Hotel bills from nearby towns, restaurant receipts for places she'd never mentioned visiting, charges for things that weren't for me and certainly weren't for her family. Each piece of evidence was like a tiny dagger, chipping away at me bit by bit. She'd always been my partner, my confidant, and now I felt like I was living with a complete stranger. And the worst part? I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I wasn't prepared to hear whatever excuse or fabrication she'd concoct because deep down, I knew I'd reached a point of no return. Have you ever felt your heart pounding so forcefully that you could hear it in your ears? That was me, standing there with Grace's work laptop sitting on our kitchen counter. She'd rushed out for some work event with her boss, leaving it behind, probably too preoccupied with whatever lies she was feeding me that night. I'd spent hours agonizing over her whereabouts, picturing her with him, wondering what she was doing, or worse, what they were doing. I'd replayed the possibilities in my head 1,000 times, but the laptop? That felt like the key, a way to finally end the speculation, one way or another. I stood there staring at it. Opening it felt like crossing a line I'd never crossed before. I told myself it was a violation of privacy, but who was I kidding? Privacy? She'd shattered that the moment she decided to deceive me. I was just so damn tired of the uncertainty. My hand trembled slightly and I remember my finger hovering over the lid, hesitating. Finally, I opened it, my heart hammering harder than ever. She hadn't even logged out. Her inbox stared back at me, almost daring me to look. I told myself, if there's nothing here, I'll close it and never mention this. But some part of me already knew what I'd find. I wish I could say I found a few harmless messages. I wish I'd found nothing but mundane work emails. But right there, at the top of her inbox, was a message from her boss, Max. Just seeing his name felt like a punch to the gut. I clicked, and there it was, in black and white, messages filled with the kind of intimacy that left no room for doubt. Phrases like, "Looking forward to our meeting tonight," and "You looked incredible last night." They talked about promotion meetings, but the only thing they were promoting was their own clandestine affair. The words blurred in front of me, and I had to blink hard to keep reading. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach, like I'd swallowed poison. She'd written to him about me. She called me underdeveloped and unambitious. Apparently, I wasn't the partner she needed in her life. The kicker? I'd been the one supporting her through every career choice she'd made. She used to thank me for encouraging her, for being her rock. Now, I was nothing more than a stepping stone, something she'd outgrown. I kept scrolling through email after email, seeing every detail of their relationship laid bare in her inbox, like she couldn't care less if I discovered it. She didn't even have the decency to hide it. I'd been so naive, thinking she was staying late at work because she was dedicated to her job. The only thing she was dedicated to was Max. Every line, every little romantic nuance they exchanged felt like a stab to the heart. The worst part was seeing how she described me to him, like I was some kind of impediment or a joke. She talked about me like I was holding her back, like she was trapped. The woman I thought I loved had transformed into a stranger, one who apparently loathed me enough to flaunt her affair with her boss while I sat at home, oblivious. I'd had enough. I closed the laptop, but the betrayal felt too raw to contain. I called Lawrence that night. He was the one person who'd been listening to my suspicions, taking them seriously. I told him everything. Every detail I'd uncovered, every sickening word they'd exchanged. He was quiet for a moment, just listening. Then he said, "You need to think about what you're going to do next. Confronting her might not be enough." He suggested contacting Max's wife, Karen, to see if she'd noticed anything amiss. I hadn't considered that, but the more Lawrence spoke, the more sense it made. I'd been so consumed by my own misery that I hadn't considered the possibility that someone else might be enduring the same hell. Lawrence admitted he'd noticed something between Grace and Max, but he hadn't wanted to interfere. When I found Karen on social media, my hands were still shaking. I sent her a message explaining the situation as carefully as possible. I didn't want to sound like a madman, but I needed answers, and she was the only person who could provide some insight. I didn't sleep much that night, tossing and turning, half dreading that she'd respond with denial, that maybe I was reading too much into things. But Karen responded. She was blunt, almost as if she'd been waiting for someone to come forward. We agreed to meet at a nearby cafe, and when I walked in and saw her, I could tell instantly that she was going through her own personal nightmare. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her eyes met mine, and there was this unspoken understanding between us, this shared devastation that didn't even need words. I laid it all out for her. The emails, the messages, every disgusting little detail. She didn't say much at first, just nodded and listened, her face growing paler with every word. Then she started talking. She told me about her own suspicions, how Max had been growing distant, making excuses about working late and taking more business trips than ever. She'd suspected something was amiss but hadn't realized the extent of it. Max had a history, apparently. He'd used people at work before, but she never thought he'd cross that line with Grace. Karen broke down, but even through her tears, her jaw set harder. There was a fire in her eyes, and I could tell she was as determined as I was to do something about this. She told me more about Max's manipulative tactics, how he'd use his position of power to exploit people and discard them once he was done. Grace was just another pawn in his game, and she either didn't see it or she did and didn't care. Either way, they were both in this mess together. It was a relief to have someone who understood, who was equally devastated but equally driven to take action. As we sat there dissecting every lie, every betrayal, something shifted within me. I wasn't going to be the fool who let this slide, who just walked away with his tail between his legs. I could see the same resolve in Karen's eyes. We weren't just victims. We had a chance to turn this around, to make them pay in a way they'd never forget. We sat there for hours, strategizing, sharing details, comparing notes. She mentioned that Max had some questionable financial practices, ways he manipulated company records to get what he wanted while keeping his hands clean. That got my mind working. If we could expose him, if we could hit him where it hurt, we'd bring down both Max and Grace. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming our dignity. By the end of that meeting, we had a rough outline of what needed to be done. We didn't have all the details yet, but we were both committed. This wasn't going to end in some quiet confrontation or a half-hearted apology. They wanted to play games with our lives? Fine. We'd give them a game they wouldn't forget. It was one thing to fantasize about revenge, but sitting down with Karen and actually planning it out made it feel real. We weren't just victims anymore. We were becoming something else, something stronger, more determined, and perhaps a bit ruthless. It didn't even feel wrong, not after everything they'd put us through. Karen was the one who planted the seed. She had a fire in her that I hadn't seen before, a resolve that almost made me feel like I was playing catch-up. Over coffee, she laid it out. Max had some shady financial dealings, ways he manipulated the company's records to benefit himself. She knew enough from overheard conversations and disgruntled employees to be certain that, with the right nudge, we could expose him. All it would take was creating the right scenario, planting documents, making it look like he'd taken one too many shortcuts. As we brainstormed, an idea struck me. Lawrence had connections at Grace's workplace, and he could get the rumor mill churning about her relationship with Max. If enough people started talking, it would be impossible for her to maintain the facade of professionalism. Grace prided herself on appearing polished, untouchable. The thought of stripping that away from her, it felt damn good. To hammer out the details, Karen invited me over for dinner. It felt strange walking into another man's house to plot his downfall with his wife. Max had probably sat at that very table, gloating over his conquest, maybe even laughing about how clueless I was. That thought alone kept me focused. We sat across from each other, delving into the specifics, bouncing ideas off each other like we'd been doing this for years. She told me about Max's tricks with the company's finances, how he'd manipulated records to inflate revenue figures. If we could plant something that made it look like he'd been caught falsifying financial documents, we could force the company to launch an investigation. If they found fraud, well, Max would be finished. Dinner turned into hours of conversation. At some point, we both started sharing stories about our marriages, the small betrayals, the disappointments we'd each endured. I told her about the Grace I used to know, the woman I thought I'd spend my life with. She talked about how she'd fallen for Max back when she still believed he was someone worth admiring. It was surreal hearing about her pain and realizing how similar it was to my own. We poured ourselves another glass of wine, and by then there was no ignoring the electricity in the room. Her hand brushed against mine, and suddenly, everything we'd been holding back came rushing forward. It wasn't just about physical attraction. It was about finding someone who understood the hurt, the betrayal, the need for something real after being lied to for so long. We didn't say anything. We just let it happen, finding solace in each other, letting go of the anger and bitterness for one night. For once, we weren't just the betrayed. We were two people finding comfort in a way neither of us could have predicted. The next morning, we didn't talk much about it. We knew what it meant, and we didn't need to overthink it. We went back to the plan, focusing on the task at hand. It was time to get serious about bringing in help. Karen mentioned an old acquaintance named Thomas. He was a financial consultant and knew his way around business deals. More importantly, he hated Max. Thomas had once been close to the company but left after clashing with Max over some creative accounting, as he put it. We reached out to him and he didn't need much convincing. Over the next few days, we gathered what we needed, planting the seeds for a deal that would look appealing to Max but would unravel his finances once he took the bait. Thomas guided us, detailing how we could set up a fake partnership, something Max wouldn't be able to resist. The beauty of it was that Max's ego would do most of the work. Once he got involved, we'd slowly pull the rug out from under him. Of course, it wasn't without complications. Karen's sister Lillian found out about our scheme. She'd come by unannounced while we were deep in conversation about Max's vulnerabilities, and she pieced things together quickly. Lillian confronted Karen, telling her to stop before things spiraled out of control. "This could ruin us all, Karen. What are you thinking?" she demanded. But Karen didn't budge. She told Lillian everything. How she found out about Max's affair, how he'd manipulated her trust. Lillian looked horrified, but Karen stood her ground, and Lillian eventually left without another word, clearly disappointed but unable to stop her. Karen and I both knew we needed more information, so we decided to reach out to one of Max's subordinates, a woman named Tessa. She'd worked under him for a while and would likely know details about his business trips with Grace. We wanted to ensure we had every angle covered. Karen set up a meeting with Tessa, framing it as a friendly catch-up and career advice session. I watched from a nearby table, out of sight, while Karen played her part. Tessa was surprisingly open, sharing how Max was notorious for private meetings that conveniently fell on weekends or after work hours. She mentioned Max's penchant for taking his favorites on overnight trips under the guise of business planning. It was all I needed to confirm what we already knew. He wasn't just manipulating records. He was manipulating people, using his position to get whatever he wanted. The plan was beginning to take shape. We had Max's financial weaknesses thanks to Thomas, and we had Grace's reputation hanging by a thread at work. With a few more nudges, they'd be too distracted by their own messes to notice us tearing down their carefully constructed lives. But that wasn't the end of it. Tessa revealed something that made our blood run cold. Apparently, Max had hinted that he was considering a new promotion for Grace, something that would put her even closer to him at the company. If she accepted, it would be harder to pull her away from his influence, and she'd have even more resources to help cover his tracks. That realization lit a fire under both of us. We weren't just taking down two cheaters. We were pulling them out of a toxic relationship they didn't even seem to understand was destroying everything around them. As we wrapped up that night, the weight of everything hit me. This was bigger than just revenge. It was about reclaiming our lives and putting an end to the lies, deceit, and manipulation that had poisoned our marriages. Karen and I shared one last look before heading home, a silent promise that no matter what happened, we'd see this through together. Thomas was the missing piece we needed. He was sharp, ruthless in his own way, and most importantly, he despised Max. After leaving the company, Thomas hadn't forgotten or forgiven the way Max had manipulated and discarded people like they were disposable. He jumped on board faster than we expected. "If you're serious about taking him down," he said, "count me in. I've been waiting for someone to do it." Karen and I met him in a quiet bar downtown, the kind of place where no one looks twice. Thomas didn't waste time with small talk. He laid out exactly how we could use Max's greed and arrogance against him. We'd set up a bogus deal, something that looked like an irresistible opportunity for the company but was actually a financial landmine. With Thomas's guidance, we created a fake partnership deal designed to funnel money out of the company under the guise of investment. Max would see dollar signs and sign off on it without a second thought. By the time he realized he'd been played, the damage would be done. While Thomas worked on structuring the deal, Karen took her part of the plan and ran with it. She had a network of contacts within the business world, people who could spread a rumor without needing to know if it was true. With just a few carefully placed whispers, word began circulating about Grace's relationship with Max. Karen was masterful about it, never explicit, just enough to plant the seed. Grace had no idea what hit her. Soon enough, she began to notice the whispers, the judgmental looks from her colleagues, a sudden chill in the office. She'd built her reputation on being professional, and now people were seeing her as Max's favorite. She hated it. I could see it in her eyes when she'd come home frustrated and tense. At first, she acted like it was just stress, brushing off my questions and barely engaging. But then, one night I pushed her, dropping a casual hint, something about her close work relationship. Her face went pale, and she snapped at me, saying I wouldn't understand because I lacked ambition and wasn't on her level. The disdain in her voice was like a slap, and any part of me that felt sorry for what we were doing vanished in that moment. Not long after, Karen and I tracked down Grant, an old employee of Max's who'd been fired. After a particularly ugly argument, Max had thrown him under the bus to cover up one of his own screw-ups, and Grant had been looking for a chance to even the score ever since. When we met him, Grant didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told us exactly where to look, pointing out the weak spots in the company's financial structure, the gaps Max had left when he'd cut corners. According to Grant, Max had even borrowed from company funds a few times to finance his lavish lifestyle. Grant's information was a goldmine. Not only did it confirm what we suspected, but it gave us everything we needed to file an anonymous complaint. Karen and I crafted the report carefully, making sure it was credible but untraceable. The complaint went straight to the regulatory authorities, and it wasn't long before the company's accounting department found itself under investigation. Meanwhile, Karen secured access to a few crucial documents that Thomas needed for the fake deal. He laid everything out, creating a financial trail that would lead straight to Max, implicating him in what would look like an embezzlement scheme. Max was in for a rude awakening, and he wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. But things were boiling over at home too. Grace could sense something was off with her career even if she didn't know it was all part of our plan. She was constantly on edge, and it made her short-tempered, especially with me. Every little thing became a point of contention, and she'd throw out jabs like, "I need someone who can keep up, and I'm tired of settling." It was like she was trying to push me away, to make me feel like I was the problem. One night, after one of her tirades, I finally had enough. "Why don't you just be honest, Grace?" I asked, barely able to keep the anger out of my voice. "Who is it that you're spending all these late nights with? Your boss, Max?" She stared at me, her eyes widening for a split second before her face hardened. "Don't you dare accuse me of something like that," she hissed. But there was no conviction in her words, no real denial, just a desperate attempt to maintain control. Then, as if on cue, she turned it back on me, accusing me of being insecure and holding her back. She said she deserved a better life and that I was only dragging her down. Any last bit of hesitation I had about the plan evaporated. There was no doubt now. She wasn't the person I'd fallen in love with. She'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone who'd sacrificed everything we'd built for a fling and a shot at a promotion. And if that's who she wanted to be, fine. But I'd make sure she'd pay for it. Back at the company, things were escalating quickly. Karen's whispers had taken root, and Max was starting to feel the effects. Employees were tense, and the anonymous complaint had led to an internal investigation. Max was under scrutiny, and the once unbreakable facade he'd built was starting to crack. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that the very people he thought were loyal were the ones setting him up. The icing on the cake was Grant. He gave us one last nugget of information, something he'd found in the old financial records before he left. It was evidence of funds Max had reallocated for personal expenses, company money used for private trips, and high-end dining that had nothing to do with business. Grant had held on to it, waiting for the right moment, and now he handed it to us with a smile. He knew this would be the final blow. With the evidence we'd gathered and Thomas's expertise, we had everything we needed to set the trap. The fraudulent deal was ready, the rumors were spreading, and Max was walking straight into his downfall without a clue. All we had to do now was sit back and let the pieces fall into place. As I watched Grace leave for another late-night meeting, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had no idea what was coming, and neither did Max. They thought they were untouchable, that they could have their affair and their careers without consequences. But they messed with the wrong people, and soon they'd learn that betrayal comes with a price. The company's problems began to unravel almost too perfectly. At first, it was just a trickle, small red flags in the financial records that made Max's partners look a little closer. But as Thomas predicted, it wasn't long before those red flags turned into a glaring spotlight on Max's shady dealings. Investors started backing out of deals, board members grew suspicious, and the rumors about his special relationships with subordinates gained traction. It was a crisis he couldn't cover up, and every desperate attempt to reassure his partners only made him look worse. Meanwhile, Grace remained as oblivious as ever. She was floating on the high of her new, important role, still pretending she was some rising star in the company. It was infuriating, knowing she thought she was untouchable. So, when an opportunity came to bring her back to reality, I took it. One night, there was a corporate event, the kind of gathering she always insisted I stay away from. This time, I decided to go. I figured if she was so proud of this respectable position she held, she wouldn't mind me being there as her husband. When I walked in, I caught her by surprise. She looked rattled, giving me a nervous smile, trying to act as if everything was normal. But it wasn't normal. I saw the way people watched her, the whispers exchanged when she wasn't looking. Karen's efforts had paid off. People were noticing. This was my moment, and I wasn't about to let it slide. In the middle of her circle of colleagues, I cleared my throat, drawing their attention. She looked at me, her face falling as if she knew what was coming. "Grace," I said, my voice steady, "since you're so dedicated to your career, why don't you tell everyone here how close you've gotten to your boss, Max?" The crowd went silent. I could see the shock and curiosity in their eyes as Grace froze, her face going from pale to flushed. She tried to laugh it off, saying I was just being jealous and ridiculous, but the damage was done. People started murmuring, looking at her differently, and the more she tried to dismiss my accusations, the guiltier she looked. "I'll let you dig your own grave. You think I'm jealous, Grace?" I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm not jealous, I'm done being humiliated." The weight of my words hung in the air, and the embarrassment on her face was almost satisfying. She stammered, but there was no coming back from this. Her reputation was shot, and she knew it. As I walked out, leaving her there to face the fallout, I felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was finally out. The next day, Grace tried to salvage what little support she had left by going to her parents, hoping they'd take her side. I found out later that she told them her version of the story, probably painting me as the unreasonable husband who couldn't handle her success. But when they learned the details, when they heard the real reason why our marriage had fallen apart, they sided with me. I could only imagine the look on her face when her own parents refused to coddle her. She'd put herself on a pedestal, thinking she was above everyone, and now even her family saw her for who she'd become. The call ended in a fight, with her parents telling her they couldn't condone what she'd done. For the first time, Grace was truly alone. I thought that would be enough, but Lawrence, my friend who'd been with me through every step, came over that evening to check on me. He listened as I told him about everything that had happened, from the confrontation at the event to Grace's family rejecting her. There was a sense of finality, but also emptiness. "You know," Lawrence said, putting a hand on my shoulder, "this might be the chance you need. Maybe it's time to start over." He went on, talking about how I could finally focus on building something for myself, free from all the bitterness Grace had left behind. "I'll even back you," he added with a grin. "We'll get you started with a clean slate." It was more than I'd expected. Lawrence believed in me, saw potential in me that Grace had always tried to undermine. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. It was like a light at the end of a dark, twisted tunnel. a reminder that there was life beyond all the chaos Grace had brought into my world. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't finished. The internal crisis she'd set into motion at the company was taking its toll on Max. She knew exactly which buttons to press, questioning his management decisions and spreading rumors among colleagues, making sure they all saw him as incompetent. The whispers about his indiscretions added fuel to the fire, and the cracks in his reputation widened. Employees were tense, partners were skeptical, and Max was running out of allies fast. Karen's efforts, combined with the anonymous complaint and the fake deal Thomas had orchestrated, had created a perfect storm. The company was teetering on the edge, and Max's name was at the center of every scandal. He was scrambling to keep it all under control, but with each passing day it became clearer that his empire was crumbling. In the days that followed, I kept a close eye on Grace from a distance. She was a shell of the person she'd tried to portray. Her confidence was shattered, her reputation in tatters. It was ironic, really. She'd spent so long looking down on me, convinced that I was the one holding her back. But now, she was the one who'd lost everything. This was the beginning of the end for Max and Grace. And for me, it was the start of something new. Max's empire was on the brink, and neither he nor Grace saw it coming. The fake deal Thomas had set up did exactly what it was supposed to, exposing every little crack in the financial foundation Max had built his career on. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Karen, with her impeccable timing, had anonymously provided just the right documents to the external auditors, confirming every suspicion they had and pushing Max deeper into the hot seat. The investigation turned serious, fast. Auditors combed through the records with a fine-toothed comb, finding inconsistencies, shady transactions, and more than a few questionable expenses. His partners, once his loyal supporters, started to turn on him as the evidence piled up. Rumors turned to accusations, and accusations turned into demands. They wanted him out. Karen and I watched it unfold from the sidelines, with no need to lift a finger. Max had managed to ruin himself just by following his ego. Every email, every transaction, every conversation came back to haunt him. The man who'd built himself up as untouchable was now the company's biggest liability, and his partners had no interest in keeping him around. But this wasn't just Max's downfall. Grace was in free fall too. Her rising star reputation was gone, replaced by whispers and stares. She'd become Max's accomplice in everyone's eyes, and when the scandal broke publicly, her name was as good as mud. She hadn't just hitched her career to his, she'd tied her future to his downfall. With Max out of the way, there was only one thing left to do. I filed for divorce. The moment I handed her those papers, her mask dropped. For the first time in months, she seemed to grasp just how serious I was. She tried to downplay everything, making excuses, trying to twist things around as if I'd somehow misunderstood. It wasn't like that, she pleaded, putting on her best remorseful act. I was just caught up in something I thought was good for my career. I didn't mean to hurt you. I looked her straight in the eye and told her I wasn't interested in any more of her lies. There would be no reconciliation, no second chances. She wasn't getting a penny from me, and I made it clear I wouldn't be dividing assets. She'd walked into this mess alone, and that's exactly how she'd be walking out of it. By the time she realized I meant it, it was too late. As the divorce process started, the scandal spread to the media. Karen and I made sure every sordid detail of Max's relationship with Grace, his fraudulent dealings, and the entire fallout reached the news outlets. The company's reputation plummeted, and Max and Grace were at the heart of it. Business circles are ruthless, and once her name was associated with a corporate scandal, Grace discovered just how little sympathy people had for her. Job offers evaporated, and anyone who'd once been close to her was suddenly unavailable. Watching Grace's downfall should have felt triumphant, but mostly I just felt done. I'd shed the anger, the resentment. It was all behind me now. I was ready to focus on what mattered. Moving forward. That's where Joy came in. She'd been there all along, the reliable friend who'd stuck by me through everything, offering a shoulder to lean on without expecting anything in return. After Lawrence's investment offer, Joy and I decided to go into business together. She'd always had a mind for details, a way of seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles, and together, we built something from the ground up. It was like a breath of fresh air, having someone by my side who valued honesty and partnership, the things I'd thought I'd lost. The weeks turned into months, and somewhere along the way, things shifted. Joy wasn't just my business partner, she became the person I looked forward to seeing every day. The one who made me feel like I was building something meaningful. Slowly, we grew closer, finding comfort and trust that didn't need any grand gestures. She'd been there when I was at my lowest, and now she was there as I began to truly live again. In the end, Grace was left with nothing but the ashes of her own choices. She was alone, her career and reputation ruined, and with no one left to fall back on. Max was out of the picture, his empire shattered, and Karen had washed her hands of him too. She moved on, focused on rebuilding her own life with a quiet satisfaction, free from the mess he'd dragged her into. As for me, I'd finally found peace. My life was my own again, free from the lies and manipulation that had once weighed me down. Starting over wasn't easy, but it was worth every struggle. I'd found a partner who valued me for who I was, who saw potential where others had only seen limitations. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. Grace had been right about one thing. I did deserve a better life, and now I was living it, one honest day at a time.